All right, so continuing on with the lesson on unified land operations and the decisive action tasks. Um, this is a recap of the defense. So again, like last week's lesson, we talked about how these obstacles and positions were designed to prevent basically the offense. And so the takeaway of what our mission as the Army, as found in ADP 1, the Army, all right, pretty important document if you have not read it, talks about our service, but it specifies our mission. So this is our doctrinal based mission in the Army, and that is to fight and win the nation's wars through prompt and sustained land combat as part of the joint force. So it basically explains how we do this, okay? But the takeaway here is that unified land operations, which is covered in ADP 3-0, is our Army operational concept. And that is our contribution to joint operations, which is nested with unified action, all right, or the conduct of joint operations. And so, this shows how these things are nested with our mission, and they are executed through decisive action, or specifically offensive, defensive, stability, and DISCA tasks. All right, so the previous lesson we discussed the offense. This lesson we're going to focus on or recap the defensive tasks. All right, and so the doctrinal reference for the defense is ADP and ADRP 3-90. So, all right, the purpose of the defense. All right, key takeaway here. Create conditions for a counter, what? A counter offensive. Okay, so when we said that the offense was the decisive form of war, the defense is allowed to, or allows you to create conditions to go back on the offense. All right, and so when we talked about, what is our mission, it's to fight and win the nation's wars. The offense allows you to do that. So the defense is basically condition setting to go back on the offensive. All right. These are what defensive operations allow us to do: retain decisive terrain, which by definition, decisive terrain is what gives us a marked advantage over the enemy. Deny vital areas to the enemy. Attain or fix the enemy as a prelude to the offense. All right, so if we know that we're going to go on the offense, the defense allows us to basically hold them in place, or to attrit them, which means to diminish their personnel and their capabilities by our effects. And it forces the enemy to concentrate his forces. Okay, and so when we talk about the concept of concentration, if you remember back to the offense, and one of the characteristics of the offense was concentration. So we tend to concentrate our forces rather than our effects. And the best way I can explain that is when you're in a combat situation, soldiers tend to want to be close to one another. Whether that's like a survival, instinctual kind of reaction or what. But being close together does not necessarily mean that your effects are concentrated, just your personnel. And so the defense, one of the outcomes is that you want the enemy to concentrate their forces because in combat situations, a inexperienced leader would mistake concentration of forces to concentration of effects. All right, so that's just something to think about. All right, so the characteristics of the defense. So if you remember from the offense, the characteristics were audacity, concentration, surprise, and tempo. 4, there are 7 characteristics of the defense. So disruption, flexibility, mass and concentration, operations in depth, preparation, maneuver, and security. All right, so take a minute to read each of those. I won't insult your intelligence and read them to you. Here is that concentration, mass and concentration. All right, so that's actually one that's similar to the offense. Also pretty important, the types of defensive tasks. So you have area, mobile, and retrograde defense. Each of these, so area defense, you're denying enemy forces terrain for a specific amount of time versus destroying the enemy outright. All right. Mobile defense, destruction of the enemy by allowing him to advance to a position exposing him to a counterattack. And retrograde defense, organized movement away from the enemy by delay, withdrawal, or retirement. So let's clarify something real quick. There is a difference between retrograde and defeat. So if we go into the mission of the Army, which is to fight and win the nation's wars through prompt and sustained land combat as part of the joint force, and you go to the purpose of the defense, which is to create conditions for a counteroffensive, which we know the offense is designed or is the decisive form of war. All right. A retrograde defense allows us to have movement away from the enemy, but it's different from retreat in that retreat is simply a survival action. You are basically running away from the enemy with the only outcome being survival or live to fight another day. Well, the retrograde defense, or the retrograde I should say, is designed as an organized movement so that you can in fact go back on the offensive. All right, and so that is by delay, withdrawal, or retirement. Okay, and the ADP 3-90 and the ADRP 3-90 go further into depth on that. Okay, so you guys have figured out by now that I'm a pretty big doctrine guy. I like to reference the doctrine. So the purpose of the defense. Commanders choose to defend to create conditions for a counteroffensive. So there you have it again. To attrit or fix the enemy. Characteristics of the defense. So they explain that in depth. You could read that on your own. And so the three basic defensive tasks of area defense, mobile defense, and retrograde. All right. Explains each of them. All right. And then the 3 forms of retrograde are delay, withdrawal, and retirement. And it goes into more detail on each of them. Delaying, withdrawal, and retirement. Okay, so basically summarizing what delay is, force that's under pressure trades space for time by slowing down the enemy's momentum and inflicting maximum damage on the enemy without, in principle, becoming decisively engaged. A withdrawal is planned, in which a force in contact disengages from an enemy force and moves in a direction away from the enemy. Withdrawing units, whether all or part of a committed force, voluntarily disengage from the enemy to preserve the force or release it for a new mission. So again, that's not the same as retreat. That is condition setting to go back on the counteroffensive. All right, which is the purpose of the defense. And then the retirement, the force out of contact moves away from the enemy. All right, so that's basically the summary of the defense. And you can continue to read. There are forms of the defense. defense of a linear obstacle, perimeter defense, and reverse slope. You can go find more information about that in the ADRP 3-90 as well as the FM 3-90. There's volume 1 and volume 2. All right, so it explains it much more in depth, the conceptual aspects of the offense and defense 3-90. All right, so here's the ADRP. Choose to defend to create conditions for a counteroffensive. Where have we heard that before? All right, so all right, so that is it for this lesson recap. The other two tasks associated with decisive action as part of unified land operations are stability and defense and support of civil authorities. And those are covered in 3-07 and 3-28 respectively.